Her name was Leora. The villagers never said it aloud after the trial. It clung to the air like the smell of wet smoke, the scent that would follow her long after the fire went cold. She was 17, they said, with eyes too sharp for a girl, and questions that cut deeper than her place allowed. When she asked why the priest's words burned only women, they called it arrogance. When she laughed at the council's decree of purity, they called it sin. And so, they blindfolded her. The cloth was rough, woven from coarse flecks. As it pressed against her eyes, the world shrank into darkness and scent. The smoke, the damp fear, the sick sweetness of burning wood. That smell would become the soul of the ritual. It was always there, in every trial, in every whispered story. The smoke of sanctity, they called it. But in truth, it was the smell of obedience burning alive. They led her to the edge of the fire path, a stretch of glowing embers framed by 2 wooden stakes, each bound with garlands of flowers already wilting in the heat. To the onlookers, it was not an execution. It was a test, a divine gamble. If her heart was pure, the flames would yield. If it was stained by deceit, the fire would consume her. Simple, beautiful, final. That was the paradox, the purity game that promised justice through agony. A system that dressed torture in silk and prayer. And tonight, in this story, we're going to walk that path. You will hear about the fire path ritual, the ceremony that turned women's pain into spectacle. You will see how belief became weapon and how purity became the sharpest blade of all. You'll learn what happened to those who walked the flames blindfolded, trusting in gods who never spoke back. This is not just history. It's a reflection of the machinery behind it, the ritual of control. Because cruelty, when sanctified, does not disappear. It evolves. So if you think stories like this belong to another time, stay with me, because the embers of the fire path still glow, beneath other names, in other places. They said Leora's trial was fair. The priest chanted, the men of the village nodded, and the women, those who dared to watch, stood in silence, clutching their shawls against the rising heat. The ritual required that no one look away. To look away was to doubt divine judgment. She took her first step. The wood hissed beneath her, and smoke curled upward, slow and alive, wrapping her in its ashen embrace. The crowd murmured a single word over and over. Pure, pure, pure. The repetition was hypnotic, like a heartbeat. The priest timed it perfectly. Repetition was key. It erased thought, replaced it with rhythm. Behind the blindfold, Leora saw nothing, but she heard everything. The shuffle of feet, the wet crackle of sap bursting in the coals, the whisper of her mother's breath caught in her throat. That smell, the burning wood mixed with fear, pressed into her lungs. The fire path wasn't meant to kill every woman who walked it. That would have been too obvious. It was meant to prove that death was their own fault. If you burned, it was because your heart wasn't pure enough. If you survived, it was because the gods forgave you. Either way, the system won. That was the brilliance of it. The cruelty hid behind divinity. The men who designed the ritual did not call themselves executioners. They were purifiers. And the women who died beneath their gaze, were they martyrs or warnings? Leora stumbled halfway across. The embers flared beneath her bare feet, a hiss of flesh, a gasp. The crowd leaned forward as if watching theater. And perhaps they were. After all, that's what the fire path was, a performance of faith, scripted by fear. Even the blindfold was symbolic. It represented surrender, obedience, and above all, silence. The women could not see their accusers. They couldn't even see the fire that killed them. The priest said it was mercy, that blindness before the flames made the pain bearable. But those who had walked it before whispered another truth, that the darkness behind the cloth was the last thing you saw before the world went quiet. Leora's legs trembled. She took another step. The chant grew louder. Pure, pure, pure. Her name was gone now, erased by ritual. In the crowd, her mother bit her hand to keep from crying out. A young scribe at the back was recording the event, his quill scratching furiously. He would later describe her as unrepentant, proud, and unbroken until the end. Those words, written in ink and sanctified by seal, would justify her death for generations. You see, the fire path wasn't born in one village. It spread across provinces, faiths, even empires. Each version carried the same core, the purification of women through ordeal. Whether it was coals, boiling water, or iron, the logic remained. If they were pure, the body would not burn. And people believed it because belief was safer than doubt. Doubt meant danger. Doubt meant you might be next. Leota reached the final steps. The wood beneath her feet had cooled to ash, but her skin was already gone. She collapsed forward, half conscious, her body steaming in the night air. The priest raised his hands and declared her verdict. Impure. The crowd exhaled, relieved. The ritual had worked. Order was restored. The gods, they said, were satisfied. And then, as they dragged her away, the smell filled the square again. That bitter perfume of smoke and sanctity creeping into every corner. That smell became memory. That smell became law. That smell even now clings to our history. So when you see the image of the fire path, when you hear of blindfold, purity, and flame, remember that it wasn't just superstition. It was structure. It was control disguised as faith. And if you think that kind of fire is gone, look closer. It burns quietly now, in words, in judgments, in systems that still ask women to prove their purity. The fire path was only the beginning. Before we walk further into its origins, the laws, the motives, the machinery that made it sacred, take a moment. Look at the smoke. Smell it. That same scent of burning wood and damp fear still lingers wherever power demands obedience. Because cruelty never dies. It just learns to pray. Stay here in the archives. Subscribe if you haven't already, and walk with me deeper into the history that was never meant to be told. The fire path is waiting. They called it the trial of fire, but behind the chants, the incense, the trembling faith, there was structure, there was intent. Every flame, every step, every word had a purpose, carefully built to make cruelty look divine. The fire path was not chaos, it was governance. To understand how it ruled, you must see its architects, not the priests who lit the embers, but the councils that approved them. The purity edicts, carved into black oak tablets, declared that woman was the vessel of moral order. Her fall, through lust, deceit, or disobedience, was not private sin, but social contagion. One woman's impurity could doom an entire village. And so, they built a cure. The cure was spectacle. If women feared the flames more than their own thoughts, the order would stand unchallenged. The fire path, blindfold and all, was never about purity. It was about preservation, of power, of control. That same smell, the smoke mixed with damp fear, was more than scent. It was message. When the wind carried it through the streets, children would whisper, "Another one walks tonight." It told them that obedience was survival. The priest said the fire saw truth, but the fire never saw anything. It only consumed what it was given. The ritual began with selection, The accused was chosen not just for her supposed sin, but for her symbolism. The widow who refused remarriage, the girl who spoke out of turn, the sister who taught another how to read. Every impure woman represented defiance, small acts that cracked the walls of the order. The trial was a way to seal those cracks with fear. Once chosen, the accused would be confined for 3 days. She was forbidden to speak, fed only salted broth to cleanse her tongue. The blindfold was woven in front of her, blessed with ash from past trials. The irony, obvious to us now, was that each cloth carried the residue of the women who had already burned. The ashes of the impure became the mark of purification. They turned death into an inheritance. During preparation, the high priest, the ardent keeper, would instruct the crowd in their role. Silence was sin. Murmuring was doubt. They were told to chant rhythmically, to sustain the trial's sacred energy. In truth, the chanting muffled the screams. It made the horror palatable. The mechanism of belief was astonishingly efficient. If the woman burned, it proved her corruption. If she survived, it proved the god's justice. Both outcomes justified the ritual. There was no possibility for failure, only interpretation. That's how systems survive centuries. They make themselves unfalsifiable. And yet, beneath the official order, there were always cracks. There were always whispers of those who didn't burn, those who stumbled across the coals yet emerged alive, scarred but breathing. They were celebrated for a night, then vanished by morning. Some said the priests couldn't risk keeping them alive. Survival made the ritual look uncertain, and uncertainty was the only heresy they couldn't forgive. Still, others whispered something more dangerous, that the ones who lived had seen something while blindfolded, that the darkness behind the cloth was not empty, but filled with eyes, watching, judging, not divine, but human. That, they said, was the true revelation. One chronicler, an apprentice scribe named Raylan, wrote privately about what he saw during a trial in the province of Thren. He described the keeper's hand, a hidden figure beneath the platform, feeding the flames with oil-soaked wood only when the accused stumbled. It was rigged, controlled. The purity test was no test at all. Raylan's notes were confiscated and burned. His tongue was purified with iron. Yet the truth leaked out. It always does. The fire path endured not because of faith, but because of fear. And fear needs ritual, the way fire needs oxygen. It must be fed continuously. The priests knew that. Each ritual renewed the collective submission, reminding every watching woman that her silence kept her safe. Every ember in that pit was a sermon. Every scream, a lesson. The most horrifying part wasn't the burning. It was the belief that those women deserved it. Even now, when we read their records, the language betrays complicity. Trial, they wrote, confession, mercy. But the words rot when you touch them. Beneath them lies a single unchanging truth. This was punishment disguised as piety. And still, the smell of the smoke lingered. It filled temples, homes, dreams. Survivors said it clung to their hair, their clothes, even their prayers. One woman, Mirren of Hara, wrote in her confession, "The fire did not take me, but the smoke followed me. It lives in my breath. I feel it when I speak. It reminds me to stay quiet." That is how the fire path worked, not just through the body, but through the mind. It rewired survival into submission. Each ritual created not only ashes, but silence. And silence is the most obedient servant of any empire. But even within that silence, resistance flickered. Some women began marking the blindfolds differently, sewing secret stitches into the edges, invisible unless you touched them. They called it the thread of witness. It was their only rebellion, a hidden record of every woman who walked the fire before. Each stitch meant
I saw you." The priests never noticed. They burned hundreds of blindfolds without ever realizing they were destroying the names of their victims' sisters. Even the ashes kept memory. There's something almost unbearable in that, isn't there? That the same smoke used to erase them became their monument. You could smell it and remember. The fire path was a perfect machine. It fed on faith, fear, and fire, and left behind the illusion of purity. But in the corners of every record, in the footnotes and margins, there's always something that doesn't fit. A witness who didn't recant, a survivor who disappeared, a priest who left no grave. The mechanism worked flawlessly until it didn't, until someone stepped onto the fire and refused to fall. And when that happened, the entire foundation of the ritual began to tremble. Because purity is never what they said it was. It's not the absence of sin, it's the absence of power. And when the powerless stop believing in the fire begins to die. That's where the story turns next. Into rebellion, into exposure, into the moment when the flames finally revealed who they were truly feeding. Stay with me. The ashes are about to speak.
They said it began with silence, then a scream, but the records disagree on who screamed first. Some claimed it was the ardent keeper himself, the man who had lit the fire for years without trembling. Others said it was the crowd, stunned into disbelief as the woman did not burn. Her name was Elaine, another name almost lost to ash. She was 23, accused of spiritual deceit. Translation: she had read something forbidden. She'd spoken against the decree that women were born closer to sin. She said before her trial that the fire did not test purity, it tested compliance. And those words, whispered in a corner of the marketplace, spread faster than smoke. They called her dangerous, so they blindfolded her. The cloth scratched her face, rough and gray from 1,000 other trials. The smell rose again, the thick perfume of burning wood and damp fear. To the crowd, it was holy scent. To Elaine, it was memory. She had smelled it before, when they burned her friend Mira 3 months earlier. This time, she promised herself, the smoke would mean something different. The trial began, as always. The crowd gathered, chanting the rhythm drilled into them. The keeper's voice rose in blessing. The embers glowed like the eyes of gods. Elaine stepped forward. The first step, nothing. The second, heat, sharp, immediate. The third, pain, sudden and electric. She did not fall. She moved slowly, deliberately. The chant faltered. A priest shouted for her to stop, but the keeper silenced him with a gesture. Let the gods decide. The embers hissed beneath her bare feet. She whispered something none could hear over the crowd. Later, survivors claimed they caught fragments. Fire cannot judge, only men. When she reached the middle of the path, something went wrong. The flames did not rise. They should have flared, fed by the oil the keeper's hand would pour from below. But the mechanism was empty. Someone had removed the oil. The fire dimmed. The crowd shifted uneasily. The keeper's hand, hidden beneath the platform, was gone. Elaine stood still, the blindfold trembling as she breathed. The fire that had devoured so many women sputtered and died. The silence that followed was not peace, it was collapse. Because for the first time, the fire had failed to consume its offering. And when a god fails to act, faith cracks. That night, they tried to rewrite what happened. The keeper declared it a divine pause, a test for the priests themselves. But the story escaped. The merchants carried it in whispers across provinces. They said the fire did not take her. The gods hesitated. And that hesitation spread faster than any flame. For the first time in generations, women refused to walk. In the next trial, 3 accused knelt at the edge and did not move. When the keeper's hand poured oil to raise the flames, the crowd began to murmur, "Do you see it? He feeds it." The illusion shattered. The priests tried to restore order with spectacle, larger fires, longer chants, harsher punishments, but the smell of smoke no longer inspired awe. It brought nausea, dread, doubt. The people began to see what it really was, not divine scent, but human evidence. It was the smell of flesh, and they could no longer pretend otherwise. The fire path crumbled not from rebellion alone, but from exposure. The machine depended on secrecy. Once seen, it could not work. But exposure has a cost. The first to speak the truth died violently. Raylan's name resurfaced, the scribe whose tongue was burned for revealing the keeper's hand. His writings were found buried beneath the temple floor, protected by a stone marked only with the symbol of a thread, the thread of witness. Elaine had been one of the women who stitched it. The discovery of her blindfold, still marked with that symbol, was the final proof. She knew. She had planned. The missing oil, the empty chamber beneath the fire pit, it was sabotage, quiet and deliberate. She hadn't walked blindly. She had walked knowingly, with her eyes covered but her mind open. The realization spread through the provinces like plague. If the fire could be tricked, then it was never divine. The priests called it heresy, the scholars called it revelation, the women called it justice. Within a decade, the purity edicts collapsed. The temples burned, not by command, but by the hands of those who had once gathered there to chant. The flames that had once devoured their daughters now consumed the altars. And yet, as the fire path vanished, its shadow lingered. Because though the ritual died, the thinking that birthed it did not. The same voices that once said, "The fire tests purity," began saying, "The law tests virtue." The same system, repainted in new language. Control learned to change shape. That smell, the smoke, did not disappear either. It followed the generations, invisible but present. It lingered in every courtroom where testimony was ignored, in every household where silence was called obedience. Smoke, after all, does not die with fire. It seeps. It stains. Centuries later, historians tried to sanitize it. They wrote of the fire path as folklore, symbolic purification. But the bones beneath the ash told a different story. Burned feet, fused ribs, remains found in positions of prayer and terror. One archaeologist described it best. They buried them facing east, as if still walking, as if the fire never ended. And maybe it didn't. Because when systems burn their victims and call it virtue, the fire never really goes out. It just finds new wood. Elaine's story, like Leora's, became warning and myth. In some regions, women would gather on the night of her trial, lighting candles and covering their eyes with gray cloth. Not to test purity, but to remember the ones who walked before them. To breathe the smoke, not as faith, but as defiance. The same scent, but now reclaimed. The same ritual, but inverted. Because sometimes the only way to end a fire is to step into it and show that it can die. And that's what Elaine did. She didn't escape unscathed. Her feet were burned beyond repair. She was said to limp for the rest of her life. But when asked years later if she regretted walking the path, she only said this: "No, because when I burned, they saw that the fire was theirs, not God's." That single sentence outlived every priest who condemned her. The fire path was gone, but its echo, its logic remained. The need to purify, the desire to control through shame, through spectacle. And that's where our next chapter leads, not into the past, but into the present. Because the fire path never truly ended, it simply changed its name. The flames are smaller now, hidden behind laws, screens, and words. But the smell, that same ancient smoke of fear and judgment, still rises whenever society decides someone must be purified.
And in that smoke, if you breathe deeply enough, you can still hear them.
The fire is gone. The stones are cold. The priests are dust. And yet, if you walk through the world today, you can still smell it. That faint trace of burning wood and damp fear. It lingers, not in the air, but in the systems we live inside, in the eyes of those told to keep their heads down, their mouths shut, their virtue intact. Because the fire path in its bones was never just about flame. It was about purity. And purity is an idea that refuses to die. Now, centuries later, we call it something else. We call it reputation. We call it honor. We call it image, modesty, brand, decency, discipline. Different words for the same control. Every culture built its own version of the fire. Some call it tradition, others law. In the digital age, it looks like outrage and public trials played out on screens. In certain countries, it's still ritual, still blindfolded women, still ash, still crowd, whispering about purity. The only difference now is that the flames are invisible. They burn reputations, bodies, lives, but with quieter heat. And behind it all, the same smell, that same smoke of fear and obedience. Let's be honest, society has always loved to watch women walk the fire. It just keeps changing the reason why. In one century, it's to prove chastity. In another, loyalty. In ours, it's performance. We measure purity through public approval, not divine decree. The crowd still chants, only now it's through screens, through shares, through silence. And when someone falls, the crowd still sides with relief. The system still works. Order restored. The mechanism didn't vanish, it evolved. The modern fire path is algorithmic, social, psychological. It doesn't ask for blood, it asks for compliance, to stay quiet, to fit, to burn slowly enough that no one sees the smoke. But some still walk it willingly, believing in the same promise that deceived Leora and Elaine, that if they just stay pure enough, obedient enough, silent enough, the fire won't touch them. It always does. And when it does, society shrugs, pretending the flames are justice. This is how cruelty survives. It dresses itself in reason, in morality, in the greater good. It trades torches for rules, chants for policies, altars for platforms. But if you listen closely, beneath the hum of every era, you still hear the whisper of the old ritual. The blindfold being tied, the hush before the crowd begins to chant. Pure, pure, pure. And the air begins to fill with smoke again. That smell, it's everywhere once you notice it. In the school that tells a girl her skirt is a sin. In the workplace that calls a woman's anger unprofessional. In the court that doubts a survivor's truth. In every system that says, prove your virtue before we believe your pain. The fire path, reborn, cold, calculated, invisible, but not eternal. Because something changed when Elaine walked the coals and lived. Something irreversible. The crack cracked, and that crack never sealed. Every act of defiance since, every voice that refuses silence is another step off the embers. That is the echo. That is the inheritance. Leora's scream became Elaine's defiance. Elaine's defiance became witness. And that witness became us, the one standing at the edge, deciding whether to step forward or turn away. So here's the question that lingers, the one that matters most. When they blindfold you and call it safety, will you walk or will you refuse? Because history doesn't repeat, it reenacts. And every time a woman is told her pain must prove her purity, the fire path begins again. But maybe, this time, the fire won't win. Maybe we'll recognize the smoke for what it is. Maybe we'll stop mistaking its scent for sanctity. The truth is simple and terrifying and liberating all at once. The fire was never holy. It was never divine. It was never judgment. It was always human. Built by hands, fueled by fear, sustained by silence. And what humans build, they can also destroy. So perhaps that's what it means to end the fire path. Not to erase it, but to name it. to call it what it was, to let the world see the ashes and remember who made them. Because memory is the only water that can quench that kind of flame. When you finish the story, don't just let it pass you through. Remember the smell. Remember what it means. When you smell smoke in the words of those who demand purity, in the laws that punish defiance, in the rhetoric that burns people alive with reason instead of fire, remember the women who walked first. Remember Leora. Remember Elaine. Remember Mira. And what always tries to hide is that obedience is not purity and silence is not peace. The fire ends when we stop believing it's sacred. Until then, the embers wait, quiet, glowing beneath our feet, whispering the same ancient invitation. Walk the path and prove yourself. But now we know the truth. We've seen the mechanism. We've heard the chat for what it is. And we can answer together, no. No more blindfolds, no more purity, no more fire. Because history loves its flames, but we are the ones who can choose to stop feeding them. And that, right there, is the most terrifying truth the system ever faced. So stay awake, stay wary, and stay with us here in the Crimson Archive, where we exhume the stories that power tried to burn. Because if they feared these stories once, it's only because the truth still burns hotter than the fire ever did.